Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Edisat Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we have started a series on women in history and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will be continuing with the previous lecture that was on women and reforms. It will be second lecture in women and reform. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History in PGDAV College, Evening, University of Delhi. Her area of research is gender issues and higher education. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Thank you, Amrit. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to continue with the lecture. Before starting with today's lecture, I would like to briefly discuss what we discussed in the last lecture, since this is part 2 of the lecture series Women and Reforms. In the last lecture, we talked about the concept of colonial modernity. Then I briefly summed up historiography on the reforms, the socio-religious reform movements that we were discussing, the various historians' views, how they have kind of understood and projected these reforms and suggested various anomalies that existed in the course of the reforms. In today's lecture, I would be talking about the various ambiguities that were there as we discussed the various reforms one by one. But before we zero down to the reforms, let me briefly give you an idea of what 19th century India meant. So basically, in the early 19th century, religion gave most Indians their identity, and by the end of the 19th century, Indians were focusing on themselves as people, as a nation, and Britain as their enemy. These early nationalists first wanted reform and not a revolution. That is, at no point of time they wanted a complete overthrow of the colonial regime, and what was on their mind was to bring about socio-political changes gradually, and that too not with any kind of a revolutionary fervor. Now, having said so, I would also like to discuss that how Indians realized that what India needed at that time was modernization. Now, when I say Indians here, I mean to say a very myopic category of educated middle class Indians, and who wanted that some kind of nation building exercise should begin, and all like-minded educated Indians should come on a common platform. So, for example, we have Gopal Gokhale, a moderate nationalist who was a supporter of this view that there should be some kind of national integration and some kind of modernization before we start talking about independence. And India did get some kind of limited self-government as a result of this from the British, through a number of council acts that kept on coming from time to time and kind of increased the elected membership of Indians, but that too with a very limited vision and goal. Now, coming to what lay ahead, the road ahead, while I'm saying the road ahead, it means what lay ahead in the road of reforms related to women. Middle and upper class women had also joined various reform organizations, but the problem was that women's needs and issues were perceived as unimportant by the largely male leadership of these reforms. Another problem was that though there was formation of separate women's groups who were demanding rights to education, they were never really given much importance or given much say. And a very important change had started coming about in the Western world, and most European, North and South American universities had opened their doors to women in 19th century. But such progress had to wait for a long time since India was a colonial country and everything took much longer here to be accomplished. What was the ground reality? The ground reality was that all the calls for education in areas where women were secluded were less successful. So, for example, if one talks about the literacy rate among women, the female literacy rate in 1901 was dismal. It was 0.7%. And though male literacy also was low, but many schools that were run by Christian missionaries made parents fear that if their children, and particularly girls, were sent to attend these schools, then this would not only mean a loss of religion but also a loss of culture. Now, coming to the issue of reforms, I would be taking up various reforms one by one and discuss what all were the ambiguities that were part of these reforms. Then we would also be discussing the gender stereotypes that continued to be evoked in various debates around women and reform movements. Many of the reforms were directed towards improving women's lot, but without taking into consideration women's own aspirations, and they were far more concerned with what benefited men rather than women, even while long and heated discussions were going on to bring about a change in the lives of women. Coming to the first issue, that is Purdah. Purdah definitely falls in the list of contentious customs. That is, on the one hand, there was a wholehearted support to continue with the practice, particularly in the public sphere, and on the other hand, there was an attempt to discuss that how it was useless to be in Purdah for women, particularly a long veil which covered women from top to toe. Interesting work in this regard has been done by historian Charugupta in 2001, where she discusses that how a simultaneous condemnation and endorsement for Purdah was going on in the contemporary literature, in tracts, pamphlets, and various articles that were being written from time to time, as well as various speeches that were being delivered on various public platforms. So, for example, it was expected that women should cover themselves at public places like railway stations, roads, particularly ghats, where women could freely bathe, and a practice which was not really appreciated by the social reformers. But on the other hand, it was now expected that at least in their families, within the closed walls of homes, women would do away with the practice and their family members would help them do that. Then the reformers were equally critical of women exposing themselves on ghats, openly bathing, and not maintaining standards of decency. They were also critical of the fact that women were singing sexually explicit songs, which were kind of unduly attracting attention, and on the other hand, they were maintaining a veil at home. So therefore, we can see that how ambiguous stands were taken as far as the issue of Purdah was there. Coming to the second important reform about which much has been said and done is the issue of Sati. There were many ambiguities around Sati which need to be taken care of. First of all, the reconstitution of tradition under colonial rule, where the Brahmanic scriptures became reference points for women. So even when the colonial masters were trying to question the validity of Sati as a custom, what they resorted to repeatedly was the fact that Sati had no mention in ancient Hindu scriptures. So why was this practice continuing? Then secondly, women became symbolic of tradition, and a reworking of tradition was largely conducted through debating the rights and status of women in society. So women as symbolic of women as symbolic of tradition could very well do without sati, since sati had no mention in ancient Vedic literature. Then carefully a discourse was woven around sati, which was rooted both in the colonial and Brahmanic tradition, and to the complete marginalization of women from a debate which was largely about them and in which they had no say at all. And an interesting observation that has been made by various historians is that in this entire debate, there was no mention of barbarity that was involved in the practice of sati, not even in passing reference. So the only reference was whether sati was permissible in Vedic literature or not, and when and how the practice started. So both pro and anti-sati elements were depending on scriptures, and these scriptures were made the very basis of all kinds of debate revolving around sati. Now, coming to some more details about the scriptures and Hindu liberal reformism, wherever scriptural law was advocated, it definitely reinforced Brahmanization of gender practices, because scripture replicated upper caste values. So, most of Hindu scriptures, they talked about the role models that were displayed by the upper castes, upper class, and hardly any mention was made about the marginalized sections of society. Then Ram Mohan Roy, when he was referring to Manusmriti as the final authority which negated the very practice of sati, because Manu was silent on the issue of widow immolation and had praised celibate widowhood, was taken forward with great fervor by thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So here we have liberal reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who are trying to defend a custom, or rather criticize a custom on the basis that Manusmriti did not allow that. But at the same time, Manusmriti has so much which is anti-women, so much which is against the very principles, the very human rights that should have been given to women, and nothing of that sort was discussed. So very carefully, all those issues that suited the reformers were kind of picked like salt and pepper, and they were kind of given a logic. In the second half of 19th century, when Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar raised the issue of widow remarriage, now Manusmriti could no longer be talked about, because Manusmriti had justified pure widowhood or celibate widowhood, whereas Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was now talking about remarriage of widows. So now some other justification had to be found out, and this justification was found out in the form of Parashara Samhita, a verse in the Parashara Samhita which kind of allowed the practice of remarriage. So it kind of sanctioned remarriage. So here again we see that there is increasing reliance on scripture as the reason behind following or not following a practice. So what emerges out of this entire debate is that fact and fiction were two parts of the same coin, that is sati. While studying the issue, it is important to keep in mind a few points which were carelessly overlooked by the social reformers. What are these various points? Number one, sati was never a widespread practice in India, and it was not as if all women were practicing in all parts of India, but this fact was carefully or conveniently overlooked. Nor is it correct to think that the anti-sati movement was kind of beginning only in Bengal under leadership of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So, this anti-Sati movement had beginnings that could be traced much earlier, which were not really talked about. Then even in 19th century Bengal, it was practiced only in landed families and again only sporadically. It was not as if it was a uniform practice which had to be followed by all females of the landed family. And it was never a regular pan-Indian practice in any point of time in history. Hence, any scholarly study of Sati should not be taken as a marker for the whole of the Indian society or for all categories of Indian women belonging to all castes, communities and categories. And one must also take into account the history of anti-Sati campaign before we start zeroing down on 19th century, first half of 19th century as being the era of reformism where the issue of Sati was taken up. So, the critique of Sati did not really arise in colonial India. The beginnings had been made much earlier. And as has been pointed out by John Stratton Holley in 1993, there were a series of thinkers, historians, reformers who had been there in ancient and medieval times who had raised this issue and kind of questioned the very basis of this practice. For example, Bana made a strong critique of Sati in 7th century, calling it as a foolish mistake to think that a widow would achieve heaven after performing this. In fact, she would go to hell. Then 10th century thinker Medha Tithi, a scholar, says that Sati is against the Shastras and also against the Dharma. Then for 12th century, we have scholars like Virat and Aparak, who also criticized it, calling it no more and no less than a suicide. Then Devana Bhatta from South India also disapproved of it. And then there were various tantras which upheld the power of women. So these tantras and tantric worshippers, for example, the Mahanirvana Tantra prescribed 1-day fast for all those men who disrespected a woman and prohibited all kinds of immolation. Then we also can make a mention in passing reference to the Shakta sect, which as a whole banned Sati. Then coming to Mughal times, Emperor Akbar definitely set an example, and he tried to introduce social reforms in his empire which bans forcible immolation of a woman. So interesting emphasis here was forcible immolation. If a woman was being forced to perform it, then it was banned, but not otherwise. Then he also kind of took various other subtle measures to stop the practice of Sati by offering pension, gift, rehabilitation to the widow, so that of her own the widow would feel empowered and would be confident of her survival in the society and would not willingly immolate herself. Then we also have example of Sikh Guru Amar Das, who condemned the practice during 15th, 16th centuries, and then finally the Marathas, they banned it in their region, and the Dutch, Portuguese and French had also banned Sati in their colonies in India in the course of 17th, 18th centuries. So, all these interesting details must have been taken into account when one was talking about the discourse of anti-Sati campaign of first half of 19th centuries. Lata Mani, in her very interesting account in 1996, has pointed out to various anomalies that were there as part of anti-Sati reform. Mani has pointed out that how the initial scholarly studies were appreciative of the efforts to ban sati by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Lord William Bentinck in the early 20th century Bengal. And from the late 20th century onwards, several critical opinions emerged in this regard, where a question mark was being put as to the kind of nature of these reforms, particularly pertaining to sati. Firstly, in the entire discourse, the widow remained in the background. So, the first critique that Lata Mani has offered is that while women were, the issue of women immolation was the prime mover in the debate, women were completely absent in this entire debate, and their voice was conveniently marginalized. Secondly, the British gave undue importance to the Hindu scriptures in trying to find a justification for banning sati. This again was a very sad phenomenon, where there was a recourse to tradition in order to find tradition. So, all the talk of colonial modernity and reformism looks like a sham. Then thirdly, colonial rule's civilizational mission, which projected a very degraded view of Indian society, which was also a view that was largely carried forward by the missionary activity in India, left many questions unanswered. The reformers' discourse themselves was not free from the colonial perceptions, as they were themselves kind of swayed by the various inhibitions that were there as part of the colonial critique, and the similar inhibitions also found their way in the critique offered by the socio-religious reformers belonging to the liberal school of thought. Finally, the gains made by the British law were enjoyed not by all sections of Indian women, but largely by the upper caste and upper class women, and women on the lower rungs of the society had hardly anything to benefit out of these reforms, because these reforms were rather restricting their movement, their free movement. For example, their bathing on the ghats, which was now increasingly coming under attack, and also various social practices which earlier were being enjoyed by them as part of their cultural traditions, came under attack because these were not part of the discourse of the upper caste Hindu women. Now, the third issue that we would be discussing, and also we would be discussing the ambiguities related to this issue, is the Age of Consent Act. By age of consent, it means the age at which a girl or a woman is ready to enter into matrimonial alliance with the men, that is, starting the conjugal relationship and start living as man and wife. So, in 1891, India's political and social discourse gave lot of room for debating the age of consent bill. The age of consent for having sex was proposed to be raised from 10 to 12 years. Now, merely by raising it from 10 years to 12 years resulted in heated debate and discussions. None of the agents who were involved in the debate consulted the women they were talking about. They never took into account their issues, their thoughts, their ideas, their opinions, and no women's organization yet existed to instill a female voice into the discourse of Age of Consent Act. By excluding women's voices, the debate became a staging ground for colonization-induced insecurities of males who were debating the issue. Those against the bill had strange kind of logics, and they stated that they did not want the colonial regime to restrict religious rituals such as Garbhadhan. So basically, we have nationalist leaders, thinkers like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who took a very rigid stand, and he vehemently put his foot down against the bill, stating that the practice of child bride and marriage at such a young age was a very important ritual that was being followed in India since ages, and no foreign power had any authority to change it. And by rejecting the impositions of colonial rule, they kind of supported the right to cohabit with the child brides. The Hindu woman's body represented freedom and autonomy. Now, this is a very important point that needs further discussion. Why there was so much opposition towards this bill, that is merely raising the age of having sex from 10 to 12 years in marriage? The reason was that the Hindu woman's body was considered as beyond any debate, and no foreign power, not even the colonial regime, had any authority to make laws pertaining to it. And therefore, if Indians and if nationalist leaders, scholars, thinkers, debaters were kind of putting their foot down, it represented freedom and autonomy in their personal sphere, which they never wanted to give away or give up. So here we see that how a woman's body had to bear the brunt of the wish of freedom and autonomy that Indian males wanted to enjoy. And those who supported the bill, they tried to drive home the point that Indian society could be reformed and civilized from within, to deny the necessity of colonial intervention to reform Indian society. So here also we see that colonialism and colonial modernity were not really welcomed to intrude. So even the supporters of the bill, they wanted the initiative to come from within the Indian society and not from the outsiders. A very important role in this entire debate was played by personalities like Behramji Malabari. He was a great social reformer, a poet, a publicist, and he is best known for his endeavor for the protection of the rights of women. Behramji played a pioneering role in campaigning against early marriage, particularly the issue of child bride and the exploitation of these girls who were not even 9 or 10 years old. And a very important role in this entire debate of age of consent bill was played by the issue of Rukhmabai. Rukhmabai was born in 1864 and she was married to Dadaji Bhikaji at the age of 11. She stayed all along with her mother, and in 1884 a long struggle started between Rukhmabai and her so-called husband Dadaji. Dadaji began insisting that his wife should start cohabiting with him, should start living with him. And Rukhmabai refused to give up, and here henceforth started a legal crusade for freedom from the conjugal claims of a husband she disliked. So here we have a woman who vehemently put down her foot and refused to start living with her husband simply on the basis that she did not like him. And she also argued that she could not be compelled to consummate the marriage against her wishes. Her case became a benchmark, and it instigated an intense social and political debate, as Rukhmabai questioned the authority and the legality of Indian marriage laws. So it was a very interesting stepping stone to the future of women's rights in India. After an initial victory, a second hearing went in support of her husband, and she was ordered by the colonial court to take up her husband and to start living with her husband or face a prison sentence. Now, what happened after this would be discussed in the resuming lecture. For the time being, I would bring this discussion to an end. Thank you. We were discussing the case of Rukhmabai. Continuing from there, Rukhmabai's case had been taken up not only by some reformers in India, but also by some feminists in London. So funds were being raised to bring Rukhmabai to London, where she entered the London School of Medicine for Women and qualified as a doctor in 1894. Much earlier than many Western women, and the study of medicine was offered much later to women in England. So this was definitely an achievement for Rukhmabai and for many other women in India. Dadaji, her husband, accepted financial compensation to give up his claims over Rukhmabai, and Rukhmabai continued to work as a doctor in Bombay. She carried on writing against the harmful effects of women in Purdah and life in the zenana. Now, coming to the passing of the Age of Consent Act, another benchmark in this entire debate was how a Bengali girl lost her life as part of marital rape in 1890, and the colonial court had to acquit the husband. No punishment could be given to the husband since the girl was more than 10 years old and thus above the statutory age limit below which intercourse could be considered as rape under the Indian Penal Code. In 1891, finally, the Age of Consent Act was passed, which raised the age of consent within and outside marriage from 10 to 12 years. Now, with the passing of this act, there were large-scale heated debates, discussions, and beginning of Hindu nationalist agitations in Bengal and Bombay, because a foreign state could not legislate on Hindu religious custom. Lata Mani was especially against the reform, and he dissociated the Reformist National Social Conference with the National Congress. In 1929, finally, when liberal nationalism was at its peak and it replaced the revivalist nationalism, that many more liberal reformers, thinkers were elected to the legislatures, and many women organizations had also matured by then, that the debated issue of child marriage was finally taken up with much fervor, and it formally raised the minimum age of marriage. Now, coming to the next issue of reform movements, that is obscenity. A very interesting debate was going on regarding obscenity. There were contestations over obscenity and sexuality, and they were part of various reformist debates. The issue was over the representation of women in art, in words, in the form of written word, of legitimate and illicit relations, of normal and abnormal sexual activity, of maintaining the social order, of civilization, of modernity, as well as nationalism. There was a lot of emphasis on policing of sexuality and sexual purity, and there was definitely a defense of morality in literature and in popular cultural practices, something that has been studied in great detail by historian Charugupta. Making a point, Charugupta said in 2001, the reformist literary writers, they wanted to control certain sexual identities of women. So, as a result, many changes started emerging even in the way some mythological figures were being projected. For example, the image of Radha underwent a drastic change during this period. So, while earlier Radha was associated with love, with dalliance, with enjoyment, with fun, making fun with Krishna and enjoying life to the maximum. But now the image of Radha, was completely transformed, and what was now projected was Radha being a docile being, Radha being someone who could be worshipped. So the entire genre of discussion underwent a change. Then another very important social reform that needs detailed discussion is the issue of widow remarriage, and what were the various ambiguities and contestations that emerged as part of the debate. In the beginning, widow remarriage was projected as a way to control women's sexuality. So, when we have reformers like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who were starting a very serious campaign in support of widow remarriage, the logic that was given was not that women, especially young girls who got widowed at such young age, needed a second chance in life, or they needed an opportunity to live life once again. But the logic was that if these young girls would remain widows, then they would continue to indulge in immoral sexual practices. So, in order to bring an end to that, what was the solution? The solution was to get them married. So, this was the entire logic around which the debate started building on. There was also a sympathy among the reformers for the widow, especially the child virgin widows, since it was a practice particularly in Bengal, to marry very young girls to fully grown adult males who would definitely die much earlier than these girls. Then there was a definite shift in the arguments of reformers once the reformist movement pitched in the issue of widow remarriage. When I say reformist movement, I largely mean to say, let's take into account the various religious reform movements that began emerging, for example, Arya Samaj from 1875 onwards. The Arya Samaj publicists on this issue made some very interesting comments in the early 20th century. The debate on widow remarriage was now linked to a hardening of Hindu religious identity. It was advocated because some Hindu widows were seen as eloping with Muslim males, because Muslims had no taboo associated with widow remarriage. So, in order to find a better life and to find a life partner, the Hindu girls, they were kind of converting to Islam and getting married to Muslims. And according to Arya Samaj, this resulted in increasing in the numbers of Muslims. So here starts the reformist agenda of the revivalists. As a result, the Arya Samaj movement under the aegis of Swami Dayanand in Punjab and Western UP encouraged female education, schooling, widow remarriage, not on the basis of natural justice or gender equality, not on the basis of humanity, not on the basis of the logic of a better, more well-informed life for Indian women, but in the hope of remarried widows would be expanding the Hindu population. So the Hindu women would bear Hindu children. That was the entire logic. So Swami Dayanand advised widows to marry widowers only and to end the relationship after giving birth to a few children. So here again, the entire debate hinged around the issue of raising a Hindu population, and as if the entire purpose of marriage of a Hindu widow was to bear children and not to bear children of Muslim males. The Hindu revivalists started supporting widow remarriage to control Hindu widows' reproductivity within the bounds of Hinduism. This again, as an anomaly, has been pointed out by historians. How Hindu men were directed in this hour of crisis as part of their religious duty emerges as a very interesting information. That is, the Hindu men were advised that it was a part of their religious duty to marry Hindu widows, because if they do not do that, if they do not marry Hindu widows, then they would fall prey to Muslim men and they would inevitably give birth to Muslim children, a phenomenon which was not very welcome thought. Then widow remarriage came to be advocated for a better availability of potential childbearing wombs. So here again, the entire logic, the entire crux of argument was definitely not pro-women or a pro-liberal modern outlook. Swami Shraddhanand remarked in 1926 in his famous work, Hindu Sangathan, Savior of the Dying Race. If the onrush of Hindu child widows towards prostitution and Mohammedanism on account of the brutal treatment of their relations is not stopped by allowing them to remarry in their own community, the number of beef eaters will increase and Gau Raksha will remain only a dream of unpractical sentimentalists. So basically, the entire notion, the entire reform of Hindu remarriage was reduced to the logic of preserving Hinduism, promoting cow protection and promoting birth of virile Hindus as against any other community. And it was this logic that was being carried forward to bring about limited social reforms within families also, so that Indian women Hindu women do not rebel and do not join other households in search of a better life. Now, this entire discourse was not uniformly or unilaterally beneficial for all category of women, as was the case with many other reforms that we have discussed so far. So, for example, for lower caste widows, their argument was, and they even went to court to argue their cases, their argument was that their caste custom allowed them to inherit the first husband's share of property even on remarriage, which both Brahmanical scripture and the colonial law of 1856 disallowed. So here we have a category of marginalized women belonging to lower castes who wanted that their own special privileges should not be taken away by the colonial court, by the colonial administrative machinery, and their case should be considered as a special one. But then this was not done, and as a result of these reform movements, which were largely geared to bring about a change in the lives of upper caste women, their rights were definitely at a loss. As a result, the Allahabad court, as a result of this debate and discussion, decided that law should be most enabling. That is, it ought to grant entitlements that did not exist in the past, like the right to remarriage for upper caste widows, but it should not encroach upon existing entitlements such as inheritance claims of lower caste widows, whose laws already allowed remarriage and hence who stood to gain nothing from the new marriage laws. So therefore, Allahabad court upheld the case that was fought by the lower caste women, and they continued to enjoy their right to property which belonged to their first husbands even after marriage, and hence not lose their financial security. Now, having discussed most of the reform movements and the ambiguities associated with them, I would now like to discuss briefly the legacies of the reforms as to what happened once these reforms were put into practice and what were the changes that came about, if any. First of all, these reforms did signal new opportunities for women, however limited they were. Sexuality, love and pleasure came to be expressed in different ways and at times also came to be accepted partly. Then the spread of education among women was definitely a welcome change. New ideals of companionate and monogamous marriages and an increase in the number of households, which was also seen as undermining the joint family system, created a sense of disquiet and an increased patriarchal insecurity followed. So, for example, the breaking down of joint family system did not essentially mean a more liberated family structure for women, because now even educated women was considered as had to behave in a better way. She had to be more duty bound, disciplined, neat and clean, well versed in language, to be able to move about with her husband, to be able to take better care of children. So the entire discourse of living a life for the betterment of family, for the betterment of society, for the betterment of a strong nation definitely took a toll on women. And there was then a growing awareness of women's roles and rights in due course of time. But then one also needs to talk about unintended consequences, contradictions and ambiguities of reforms. Here I would like to talk about the vocabulary and ideas that were first employed by the reformers to control women and how they acquired their own dynamic in education, literature and popular culture in due course of time. So there was a lot of insistence on the ideal behavior of an educated woman, of a reformed woman, and how women ought to behave. The reformers also, in their writings, in their speeches, in their various publications, they cautioned against the dilution of the very ideal of pativrata. So the reformers were quite skeptical of the fact that once modern education was introduced among women, and once the reform movements would start influencing the lives of women, then maybe these women, they would go haywire and they would no longer behave in the kind of ideal pure way that they are supposed to be. So there was increasing talk, a lot of discussion on the very theme of pativrata, which became a very important part of the literature of this time, and how the breakup of joint family was considered as a loss that had to be compensated by bringing about change in the morality, in the ethics, in the language, but also at the same time keep a strict control over the way women conducted themselves. And so women were repeatedly advised against giving up domestic duties. So we have even women who are writing in various women journals that no women should indulge in mem sahib like behavior. That is, not doing any work and only talking in English, speaking in English, going out, enjoying life. So that was the mem sahib like behavior, which was not really a very welcome idea. And even after acquiring education, the prime duty was to take care of family and household chores. Now, reforms also had limited impact, and as I just mentioned, unexpected consequences. So, from the 1860s onwards in Bengal and in Bombay, many women began to write and publish critical writings about their difficulties, about their exploitation, about their deprivations, and about the orthodox social practices that had robbed them of their rights. So here one can give example of writings of Pandita Ramabai and Kailash Bashini Devi, who wrote about the hardships of upper caste Hindu women, also widows, child brides, and among Muslims we have writings of Begum Rokeya Sekhawat Hussain, who propagated against the seclusion of Muslim women. So this entire discourse kind of emerged out of the shell of male social reformers, and soon by end of 19th and early 20th centuries, educated Indian women started writing on their own lives, and we have a number of biographies and autobiographies which give us such gaudy details of what they had gone through. Women began to edit journals and gave space to their writings, and by the second half of 20th century, women began to set up their own organizations for social reforms and even assumed the leadership of many of these reform movements. And finally, Indian universities began formally admitting women and even granted them degrees even before British universities, English universities did. Now, a very important part of the discussion that is still left is how these reform movements impacted Muslim women. Now, in this, we would be discussing Muslim reformist masculinity and femininity. Education for Muslim females was justified on the ground that this would differentiate them from Hindu women who were steeped in ritualism. So this was again a kind of a benchmark for the Muslim community, that how would they dissociate themselves from Hindu community? By giving right to education to their women. And this is how they would differentiate and they would make their women appear better and on a higher moral ground. So from 1930s, with the entry of Muslim League, into Punjab politics, a question that became very important was the issue of women's share in paternal property, which Islamic law sanctioned but which tribal custom disallowed. So, since tribal custom was prevalent in most of the area around Punjab, this became a bone of contention for Muslim women who wanted that instead of the tribal custom, women should be under their own Muslim custom which allowed them a share in the paternal property. So, the League outlined that Muslims should secede from shared tribal custom, that is, they should not accept the shared tribal custom which was operating in the region, and instead they should follow the Islamic religious law which allowed women to partake in the parental property, and this would also give them a distinct communal identity. In eastern Punjab, on the issue of widow remarriage, state was in the favor of continuation of the custom of levirate that landholding Hindu, Muslim and Sikh Jats practiced. Levirate meant a custom whereby a widow was remarried to the husband's brother, and this was done with the specific purpose of preserving family landholdings, family property, so that if women get married to another family, then with her the family property would also be divided, something the families never wanted. So, widows' requests for marriages outside the family or for continuing widowhood with some land entitlements for refusal of levirate were resolutely refused. As a result, Muslim reformers attempted to take recourse to classical Islamic practices as were found in the medieval text Hidayah or in the Hanafi school of law. The divergent marriage and inheritance customs among various communities of Muslims like Khojas, Memons and Mapilas were considered un-Islamic and uncalled for. And amidst such intolerance, courts were taken recourse to by Hindu widows and upper class Muslim women, and litigation became a mode of questioning family laws. Now, having discussed some details about Muslim reform movements and what were the issues that were there, I would like to bring this lecture to an end now, but in the next lecture again we would be continuing with this rubric of Muslim reform movements and the conclusion. Thank you.
Dear friends, we hope that with today's lecture you have been able to understand women and reform and how especially in modern Indian history women and reform has taken place. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Vip for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture, and thank you dear friends for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrit.